All right, now that we are recording, good evening, everyone. Nice to see you again. Hopefully, folks will continue to trickle in as we go along. I wanted to give you a few housekeeping notes, both about today as well as some of our subsequent meetings. The meeting next week will still take place, however, will now be a check-in call. I think we are at an interesting point with some of the research that you all are undertaking and some of the partnerships that have been established. And so wanted to have an opportunity to hear more from you about where that work is, where you might be struggling, where progress has been made, how we might be able to support you, what might be learned from other students who are potentially exploring something similar. So I will put this into an email to be shared later today, but the October 31st session will be a check-in call. That is also due to the fact that our next speaker was no longer available next week. So this is our pivot. So that means that Dr. Sharon Fairley will be with us on November 7th. She will still be discussing the same themes, however, just pushed back by 1 week. As well, a note went out to all faculty advisors, deans, and law library directors at all of the consortium member schools to announce that the spring 2023 fellowship has opened. So we are inviting nominations for that fellowship. If you are a student who intends to also remain involved in the fellowship for that class, you do need to re-enroll or send me an email. I need to know that information so that I can make sure that I am tracking that accordingly. Some schools are allowing students who've been involved in this iteration to stick around for continuity. Other schools are choosing to open that up as a new opportunity to new students. So that is a decision at the discretion of each individual school. I do not have any say in it, but I do need everyone to enroll. So please keep that in mind. Finally, this Thursday, it's a bit of a plug, this Thursday is the ABA Day of Giving, and it is going to be featuring the consortium as a fundraising effort, which will support us in our growth, as well as hopefully in sponsoring potentially a conference or symposium to discuss the great research and work that you all have been doing. So please expect an email from me that is requesting money, not from you, but from your networks. If you feel comfortable in sharing that more widely, that would be fantastic. All of that, any money that is raised will go towards furthering our work and the potential development of a course, whether that be online or virtual, or exploring various lines of effort of relevance to our work. Recognizing next week will be a check-in, I do want to just take a few minutes to see if anyone has immediate questions, comments, or concerns about any of the work that they are currently undertaking, or anything that want to spotlight, perhaps a major success or milestone that they reached in the last week. Okay. Any stumbling blocks? Okay. Well, have a think on that, because that will also be a question for next week. So we'll be going around, and I would like for individual updates from each of you. So have that on your list to anticipate. As I mentioned at the outset, today I'm delighted to be joined by Cynthia Lum, who let me drop her bio in the chat for the group. Cynthia and I had the privilege of working with Cynthia in my previous position at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And she is a professor at the George Mason School in my area. So you'll forgive my bias for the Eastern the DMV area. But she is University Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society, and Director of George Mason University's Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. She is a leading authority on evidence-based policing, but in addition, what I really appreciate about Cynthia is her ability to distill some very complex components into very digestible, easy to grasp dynamics. She has just a very nuanced way of speaking that I think helps anyone based off of what they, an existing knowledge, to feel more comfortable in the material that they're covering. And as we were getting set up earlier, she did indicate that this is a topic that she obviously is a preeminent expert in and oftentimes spends an entire course speaking towards. And I have asked her to shrink it down to a mere 45 minutes, but I know that there is no better person for the task. And I'm so grateful to her for being with us today, as well as bringing her enthusiasm and expertise. And in addition to the wealth of academic research that she has done, she is also former law enforcement herself, so has both that practical experience as well as having done additional research and training. And I'm just delighted that she's able to be with us today. And Cynthia, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and it's nice to see and meet everybody. Jocelyn, can you remind me when is my stop time? Because I tend to like go over and I don't even realize it.
Sure. So we have until 6:30.
Okay.
But I'd like to.
I'll stop early. Yeah,
okay,
I'll stop
fantastic.
early so that we can have questions and things like that. But I thank you, everyone. Let me just share my screen for a second so I can get that out of the way, and then we can get moving. First of all, Jocelyn, thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for allowing me to speak to your students today, and really excited because I was looking over your charge, the consortium's charge. And what I find interesting about it is that you're very interested in the same things that I'm interested in as a criminologist. And I think we're going to share a lot of similar goals, whether you're thinking about the legal profession or policing or what have you. What I'm going to talk about today applies to all aspects of criminal justice. An evidence-based approach is not just about policing. I'm the director of the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, and we focus on all areas of justice, not just policing. So I hope you all will find some nugget that you could use in your own work. And maybe I might convince some of you to think about a PhD in criminology as well. We do have a number of lawyers who are also PhDs on our faculty, and lawyers who are students of ours who are now working towards that doctorate. So just a plug for Criminology, Law and Society. I'll just note that our department is in the top 10 in the United States. Just thought I would put that in there. Well, let me start by saying evidence-based policing. This is an area very near and dear to my heart. And as Jocelyn says, it's a very large area of research. There's a lot of policing research that has been amassed over decades since, the 1970s. And I'm going to try to distill some of it for you very quickly today. But just know that I tend to focus on the areas of my own expertise, which is like crime prevention strategies, things that improve the legitimacy of the police. But there's so much other research that I won't even touch upon today that many of you might be interested in. And I'm happy to hear about your projects and think through them a little bit if you'd like to ask some questions. Okay. All right, let's start then with, hold on, let me see if my pointer works. Okay, so I want to start with this, which is a very important piece that was written by a policing scholar named Larry Sherman. And this piece is called Evidence-Based Policing. It was written for a series of lectures, very special lectures, by what was then known as the Police Foundation. It's now known as the National Policing Institute. It's like a research think tank in policing. And the National Policing Institute put out these lectures, and Larry Sherman gave one of the earliest ones back in 1998. And in that lecture, he said that police practices should be based on scientific evidence about what works best. And he was saying this as a description of evidence-based policing. Well, what did he mean by that? He meant two things. The first, he was talking about two types of research. The first is what we call evaluation research. It's research like program evaluation research that tests or that examines or that evaluates whether or not something that the police are doing is working to achieve some goal. And the second set of science or research that he was talking about in this statement was internal research by the organization itself. The data, the tracking that an agency does, the crime analysis that it carries out, the assessment of its own practices, the understanding of crime and disorder and whatever else, victimization, whatever else the police department is interested in. And this also includes internal problems as well. So like when people abuse overtime, when they use sick leave, when officers are at high risk for self-harm, when all different kinds of things, okay? It gets rolled into this internal kind of research idea of self-reflective analysis, in addition to the research analysis that, of course, is happening in many scientific circles all over the place, right? So evidence-based policing is this idea, it's this perspective that research should have a seat at the table of criminal justice. This is an old idea that comes from, where this comes from with regards to democratic governance. I mean, you could probably think about Ben Franklin and some of the things that he was talking about when he was, and the founding fathers, when they were talking about the role that science might play in governance, in democratic governance. But that's kind of this concept behind evidence-based policing, as opposed to, so science as opposed to what, right? As opposed to traditions, hunches, habits, experience, storytelling, cases, anecdotes, right? In terms of what should drive police behavior and police decision-making. This is a very similar idea to something in medicine called evidence-based medicine. And that is when you're getting a treatment or when somebody's about to do a surgery on you, or when a doctor tells you to take a medicine or a vaccine, that there's some science behind it, that you know that that treatment is going to mostly help you, or that you will know the harms that will come from that treatment if you decide to take that treatment, right? So evidence-based medicine, like evidence-based policing, is this notion that we shouldn't just take medicine or take a treatment just because a doctor says, well, I think that might work, right? It's because it's been tested, it's been scientifically evaluated, and we also know the harms that could come from treatment when we're using them, okay? Now, some of you might already be asking, okay, well, isn't this how policing is done? Wouldn't police use science or what is known to work in terms of all their different tactics and strategies and activities, et cetera? And wouldn't they want to use that? Well, no, the answer is no. I don't even know how to say it in a nice way. Policing is not run by science. It's run by, sometimes by process. A small portion of policing is guided by the law, but most of it is guided by kind of the personal experiences of officers, a lot of anecdotes and traditions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Okay, so this core element, this core idea of an evidence-based approach to policing, to prosecution, to legal defense, to judging, right? An evidence-based approach to these things, at the core of this idea is that we're trying to link the actions that those groups are doing to the desired outcomes. Now, police do a lot of actions. I don't know if you all can use your chat. I don't even know if I can see the chat. Hold on. Let me see if I can. But can you all just throw into the chat, what do you think that cops do all day? What kinds of things are they doing? Paperwork, yes. Traffic stops, yes. Stopping people, harassing people, patrol. They drive around, right? Yes. Reports, patrol. good. Following through, yes, they like respond to you guys call 911, they're supposed to respond to those 911 calls. They might carry out an investigation, right? Welfare checks, good. Okay, so there's a ton of different things, stakeouts, right? Shelby, do you, and y'all probably watch a lot of cop shows too. Like that's all I thought cops did before I actually became a cop. Most police are not doing stakeouts, but and it's incredibly boring and horrible when you get stuck doing a stakeout. But nonetheless, yes, this is like some of the things that people think that police are doing. Okay, they also make arrests, they do investigations, they do all those types of things. Okay, well, what's the purpose of those things? Do they actually lead to their desired outcomes? Before I get into that, let me just kind of share with you a few things about what the police are doing all day long. Okay, this chart here that you're seeing comes from a paper that I wrote on can we really defund the police, a 9 agency study. And I don't provide the answer in this. This is an academic paper. But the study, it focuses on looking at the millions and millions of calls for service that the police are dispatched to every year. And there are tons of them. I mean, any one given agency could have 1 million some calls per year that they're responding to, okay? And as you can see here, and this is just a summary of the 9 agencies that we study this data on, but as you can see here, a lot of what the police are getting called on are for everyday, mostly minor things. They're traffic related, they're disorder related. They're for like people call and they say, I see somebody outside. It's like suspicious person. They're doing follow-ups. And sometimes they're handling property crimes like people, not usually burglary. It's usually like destruction of property or something like that, okay? So I put this up just to make a point. The vast majority of what police get called for in 911 calls are for like everyday conflicts and disorders, okay? And I also wanted to show you this chart, also from the same study, where we looked at 5 agencies and of the 9 to try to understand what happens when they're answering these calls for service. What do they actually do when they're dealing with these millions of calls for service? The vast majority of time, they're not doing anything official. They are not applying the law in any sort of way. They are just what we generally call assisting. They're either responding, they're providing some information, they may tell someone to go away, they might move people along, they might actually do nothing, okay? But it's not recorded as do nothing in the CAD. So usually it's just recorded as assist, okay? Even less frequently, they're writing reports, an official report of a crime that actually occurred. And even less frequently, they're making arrests. The use of arrests, the use of force, whether legal or excessive, is very, I don't want to say rare, but it's not one of the things that police are doing on a day-to-day basis, okay? The vast majority of time, they're doing things that are not what I would call not really enforcement oriented, okay? So police are involved in a variety of things, and these variety of things are often minor, and they're often not related to any kind of enforcement activity. So I just want to kind of I want you to keep that in mind as we go through evidence-based policing. For some reason my clicker's not working. I'm going to give that up. Okay, aside from answering these calls for service and writing reports and sometimes making arrests, right? The police are doing a lot of other things, and many of you kind of mentioned this in the chat. They're doing things like preventative patrol. What does that mean? They're driving around. What they're doing while they're driving around is wide and varied. They might be looking for suspicious activity. They might not be doing that at all. They might just be driving around in their post to show visibility. Sometimes they're not driving at all. They might just sit someplace and wait for the next call to come in, okay? Police are, and this varies across individual officers. Some officers are out there doing a lot of preventative patrol. The officer right next to him might be doing nothing. and it's wide and varied across policing, okay, within the same squads. The police also are doing investigative work. They're doing related practices related to investigation, search and seizure. This is usually done by detectives, but sometimes patrol officers are doing this. They do community activities, engagement with the community. Again, wide and varied. Some officers engage in this, some officers don't. They do proactive enforcement. Many of you talked about stopping people, traffic enforcement, stop and frisk, those types of things. Police are engaged in those pedestrian stops and traffic stops. They're also sometimes doing what we call proactive problem solving. They're trying to somehow solve a problem that keeps coming up over and over again so that they don't have to do it again. Okay, this is more rare, actually, this proactive problem solving, which will make more sense in a few minutes, but that's something that they're also sometimes engaged in. And finally, there are tons of internal practices that the police are engaged with. Recruitment, retention. They've got like accountability systems that they're trying to implement, supervisory systems. They're doing training. They have wellness programs. There is so much that the police as an institution are doing, not only externally and inside the community or answering calls or achieving public safety or what have you, but also internally, training, etc. Okay. So let's go back to this slide right here. We've talked a lot about what the police are doing, all these different things, right? Remember, evidence-based policing is asking a very basic question. Do all of these things that they're doing achieve desired outcomes that we, because it's a democracy, it's about what the people as a whole think the police should be about, right? So does it achieve what we think police in a democratic society should be achieving? Okay. Well, this is a challenge because, first of all, not everybody agrees on what these desired outcomes should be for the police. But these desired outcomes are challenging. So let me try to offer a few that I think there's some consensus around about what the police should be doing, what kind of outcomes they should be achieving. Okay. I think the most common thinking behind why the police do the things they do is because they're trying to detect, prevent, deter, respond, reduce crime. Okay. They're responsible, we think, for public safety. And so we hope that they can do these things, right? We also believe, especially in modern advanced democracies, that the police are responsible for doing so by achieving trust and confidence amongst the citizenry. Why? Precisely because of the nature of our democracy. They get their power from people, not from, and from the law, and not from some internal decision that they've made about what they should be doing, okay? So trust and confidence within the community is so important. And of course, we see the ramifications of decades of not doing that very well after George Floyd, okay? And the protests after George Floyd. The police are also responsible for achieving distributive and procedural justice. These are probably terms that are very familiar to law students, but these are things that the police are responsible for equal protection, and for also procedural justice in particular, for the respectful treatment of individuals, even when they may have to arrest them. Okay. We hope that the police can also resolve disputes and keep the peace. Why? Because as I showed in that previous chart, most of the time they're not dealing with crime. They're dealing with like conflict that can turn into crime, but it's conflict between people, and they're trying to resolve and keep the peace and resolve those disputes. Internally, the police hope that they maintain good job satisfaction with officers, and they want to retain officers. This is a huge problem in policing right now. Most police are understaffed, and people don't want to join the police. And all of you could probably guess why this is, but especially post-Floyd, I think they've really hit a low point in terms of selling the profession as one that is that people should make a profession out of. Right? Not to mention there's many other reasons why why people don't want to become police officers. They want to maintain officer safety and wellness. And many organizations hope for maintaining a highly functioning and nimble organization. Okay, so you can imagine, I just want you all to imagine desired outcomes in the legal field, right? What do lawyers do? What do they do? Prosecutors, defense attorneys, what are they doing all day, right? And do those things, do those activities, judges, do the activities that they're doing actually achieve desired outcomes that you're hoping to achieve? And that's the core question of evidence-based policing. All the science to try to answer, what is science? What is why do people get PhDs? It's just to learn how to ask and answer questions. That's it. That's what the PhD is about. Okay. And that's what science is about. How can I ask a question and then answer it using the best available methods possible? Okay. And so evidence-based policing tries to link the actions of the police to the desired outcomes by looking at it through a scientific lens. Okay, part two. Okay, we know what evidence-based policing is. So are American police evidence-based? Okay, what do we know about whether the activities that they're doing actually lead to the outcomes that they have? Let me just say that there are hundreds and hundreds of evaluation studies, many of them very good, about what the police are doing and whether or not the things that they're doing are effective. I'm going to try to distill all of this in 6 principles for you. For those of you who are interested, we've written a book on this that kind of gives a summary of the different elements of this research that I'm about to share with you. We also have a tool, it's free online. It's called the Evidence-Based Policing Matrix, and you can see some of this research and some details about this research, okay? But I'm going to give it to you just in 6 principles. All right, principle number 1. What do we know about the research about what the police are doing? We know that an over-reliance on arrest is not going to reduce crime. And this is the hardest one to sell when I talk to police officers about this. Why? Because almost everything, even though they're not arresting that frequently, almost everything that they're taught in the academy, everything that they're doing in life is really focused around this idea of arrest, okay? They're very preoccupied with it, okay? And we now know from a ton of research that arrest is not a very good deterrent, okay? How do we know that? Well, a couple of some clues. Clearance rates in the United States, like the ability to clear crime, like homicide or robbery, those things have remained stable for decades, despite the fact that crime has been going up and down, wildly fluctuating over these decades, okay? So the ability for an agency to clear its crime that it's trying to investigate has very little link to whether or not a place is going to have lots of crime or low amounts of crime, okay? Arrest is very reactionary. A colleague of mine who, a Stockholm Prize winner, Dan Nagin, calls arrest a failure in policing. Why? Because we failed to prevent the crime from happening in the first place. Arrest is like the afterthought. The crime already occurred, okay? So arrest not very helpful. Also, let me say that there are 2 kinds of principles of arrest: specific deterrence and general deterrence. Specific deterrence is when you make an arrest of an individual. I arrest, Cynthia Lum, and something about that arrest is so negative for me that it makes me not want to do it again, okay? We know this is not really true. Recidivism rates are very high in the United States, like 70% or something like that. People recidivate. So arrest is not a great specific deterrent. Let me also say, for some individuals, juveniles, for some categories of individuals, arrest could actually make things worse. It could make them offend more in the future, okay? By the way, I can answer any questions about some of these specifics later, but I'm just going to gloss over it really quickly just to make some points. The second is that the indiscriminate use of arrest for minor offenses, some of you may know this as zero tolerance or broken windows, misdemeanor arrest. We also have evidence now that shows that that doesn't really reduce violence. There was this belief that, like in the 90s, that if you arrested a lot of people for small little things like drinking in public or jumping turnstiles or something, then somehow that would like be connected to a reduction in violence. Okay. We also know that's not true, right? And finally, let me say something about general deterrence. If I see someone getting arrested, we also believe that me seeing someone get arrested may not necessarily serve as a deterrent to me not doing the crime itself. Okay. So the evidence in this particular area tends to focus on one important principle, that arrest is not what causes deterrence. It's the perceived risk of apprehension that causes deterrence. Very different concept. Let me repeat this, okay? It's not the arrest of me that causes me to stop committing crime. What will stop me from committing that next crime is if I think a cop is coming around the corner, or if I think my mom is coming around the corner, she's gonna see me and I'll be embarrassed, okay? Something like that, right? It's the perceived risk of apprehension, not the apprehension itself. Second principle from the research, officers are much more effective when they are proactive and not reactive. Proactive policing stresses prevention. It means that the police are anticipating crime, disorder, and even internal problems like officer health and wellness, right? Or a problematic officer in the future. They're trying to anticipate that problem ahead of time before it happens. And they do this using crime analysis, problem solving, and other anticipatory research techniques, anticipatory techniques to be able to prevent something from happening in the first place. They're much more effective in controlling crime by doing that than by doing their reactive approach. What do I mean by reactive? Responding to your 911 calls, making arrests of individuals, seeing someone make a traffic violation and then stopping them for that traffic violation. Those are reactive approaches, okay? We know now from a lot of research that when officers use the time in between their calls for service, this is a time I like to refer to as the golden time of patrol. When they use that time in between their calls for service, they can reduce the level of the calls for service and hence prevent crime and disorder, okay, as measured by those calls for service. Okay? Proactivity requires tackling opportunity infrastructures for crime. Maybe I shouldn't have thrown that word out there. It's tackling the things in our environment that create the opportunities for crime to occur, right? Rather than waiting for someone to take advantage of that opportunity infrastructure and then committing the crime and then the police stepping in later on and picking up the pieces, okay? Okay. Gosh, I just realized there's so much involved in each one of these. I'm sorry that I'm only giving you a small bit. The third very important principle that comes from tons of research, police are much more effective when they proactively patrol, investigate, and mitigate places where these crime opportunity structures sit, and not just simply reacting to people or on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so some of you are watching too much Law and Order. I myself am guilty of this, okay? That Law and Order stuff, the policing stuff, the NYPD Blue or whatever people are watching now, it's all about a reaction case by case to certain things in policing of individuals. Policing is much more effective when it targets places and opportunity structures for crime at those particular places. Why do we know this? We know this for two reasons. Crime is incredibly concentrated spatially, okay? What do I mean by this? About half of all serious crime occurs in less than maybe 3% of addresses in an entire city, okay? So, and by the way, this has been found over and over and over again in rural communities. By the way, crime is even more concentrated in rural communities than in urban communities. In urban communities, it might be at that 5% level. In rural communities, it might be down to like 1% of the entire geography of a city is where crime will sit or crime will actually happen, okay? Crime is incredibly concentrated. And we have tons of field experiments. These are randomized controlled experiments that indicate when police target these particular hotspots of crime, they can be very effective in reducing crime at these places and reducing crime across, having an impact of crime rates across the city overall. Okay. Yes, Jessalyn, thank you. Thanks for putting some of the stuff into the chat. That's very helpful. Appreciate it. So police more effective when they are proactive in their places as opposed to focusing on individuals. Okay. Fourth principle that I want to make. If the police still focus on individuals, they have to, people still commit crime, and victims need justice and they need restoration. And so the police focus on people. Okay? Individual strategies are much more effective when they are targeted. Arrest is so ad hoc, it's just like willy-nilly. Okay. I was a police officer in Baltimore City. You could literally step outside the police station and see someone dealing drugs that could be arrested, right? The question is it really worth the society's time? Is it really important to arrest that particular individual? Well, that's an empirical question, right? I'm not saying, I'm not answering that question necessarily, but whether or not to arrest that particular individual as opposed to this individual over here, who might also be doing something negative, right, is discretionary in policing. So oftentimes it's just willy-nilly, where whoever wants to arrest whatever they see, okay? And some people won't arrest at all, right? Individual-based approaches that are targeted, that are strategic, are much more effective than just random reactive approaches to people. What do I mean by this? Enforcement and prevention approaches that focus on high-risk offenders. And when I say high-risk offenders, I don't mean guessing who the high-risk offenders. I mean identified high-risk offenders through risk assessment, through systematic risk assessment, through things like repeat offender analysis or social network analysis that looks at very carefully who high-risk individuals are. Gangs, parolees, repeat offenders, people that are more likely to shoot other people, that kind of targeted intervention for those high-risk offenders is much more effective. Targeted approaches that are also multifaceted are more effective than those that are more singular in nature. Some, like an arrest of an individual is like singular in nature. A multifaceted approach is one that involves other people, other collaborators. This is the pulling levers approach, where you might involve, for example, a group, a community group that works to try to extract gang members from gangs with employment opportunities, for example. Or you might be working with a probation officer who is working with an offender, trying to keep them on the path of non-offending, right? In terms of trying to address that individual through notifications or through contacts with the police or probation. Okay? Those are multifaceted approaches. Things that work on, things that include, for example, I mean, there's so much of this, cognitive behavioral therapy for high-risk kids. There's something called multisystemic therapy for young kids who are at very, very high risk of committing violence. These are serious interventions that involve social workers, that involve psychologists, and that involve resources at the family-based level, okay? These are multifaceted approaches. Okay. The fifth principle from the evidence is that officers are much more effective when they tailor their actions to problems. And this idea of tailoring is very closely tied to something known as problem-oriented policing in police work. Very simply put, and I'll oversimplify it for this purpose, but it's about trying to understand what's the underlying problem of a repetitive call for service that keeps happening over and over and over and over again. Okay, crime is actually and disorder is very predictable. It happens over and over and over again. And there's usually some underlying reason for why something's happening. A door is left unlocked. Cars are, people like turn on their cars and they leave, warm them up and they go back inside. And then there's like a rash of car thefts in that particular area. I wonder why, right? Those are simple examples. But when I'm talking about a problem-solving approach, is this idea that every type of problem has a specific mechanism for why it's occurring. And so tailored approaches try to deal with those specific mechanisms by doing things that address that specific issue, okay? They're not general in nature, like, oh, I'm gonna do a whole bunch of traffic stops because people are shooting each other over here, right? And I'm gonna also do it because I think, it'll create some more traffic safety. That's like a very general approach that's trying to apply, that's being applied to all sorts of different things, okay? Tailored approaches are more effective. And finally, without the community support, you're going to have a lot of trouble with doing evidence-based approaches to crime prevention. We know this from research. This is not my personal opinion about this, although it is my personal opinion too. But we know this from research, that when you come in heavy-handed and you do something to a neighborhood without notifying them, without telling them why, without giving them a justification, without asking them, can we do this here, right? What will be the ramifications? What are your reactions to our deployment approach? Why are we here, right? Without doing that, you're going to have less legitimacy in some of the preventative approaches that you're trying to take. And community support and input is often essential to achieving some of the things that I'm talking about in this discussion, okay? The old forms of community-oriented policing are not about this, okay? And I can talk a little bit about this later, but that was a little bit of a failure of the old forms of community-oriented policing. It didn't do enough to systematize the reaction pulling, the exchange, the engagement with the community that I think newer approaches in community-oriented policing are really trying to accomplish now, okay? Okay, so 6 principles covers hundreds and hundreds of studies that support these ideas on what can be effective in at least crime reduction and crime prevention. Now, here's the challenge that I want to pose to all of you about evidence-based policing, okay? We've got a lot of research, at least in certain areas. There are some areas where we don't have a lot of research about that's being generated more so today, but we don't have a lot of it. But we do have a lot of knowledge about what the police can do in the public safety area, at least, okay? The challenge with evidence-based policing is that almost all of the current approaches to policing are at odds with these 6 principles that I'm showing you here, okay? Let me just briefly tell you why this is the case. First, policing is incredibly arrest-centric, okay? I'm not saying that they're doing a lot of it, but the focus of policing, the mentality of the policing is often on offenders, not victims, and it's often on arrest of those offenders. Policing is almost entirely reactive, not proactive in the way that I was talking about with principle number 2. It's very procedures oriented. So the focus of policing is not necessarily how is what I'm doing attached to some desired outcome. It's what am I doing, and am I doing those steps correctly? Okay, I hope that you see the difference between those two things. It's not whether or not it's achieving this outcome. It's, am I doing these things according to some standard operating procedure that's written up in, the general orders of the police. And by the way, some of that stuff is not even guided by law. It's just guided by tradition. It's guided by what the police have done in the past. And that's how they're dealing with something, okay? Policing is not focused on prevention. It's almost entirely focused on reaction. It's not place focused. It's almost entirely people focused, case by case approach to policing. I get a call today, I deal with that. 10 minutes later, I get another call, I deal with that. I get another call, I deal with that, okay? So it's very case by case. It's not problem oriented. It doesn't smash all those calls together and then the officer thinks, oh, how can I like deal with that so I don't get these calls in the future, more in the future, right? Policing is incredibly general. You know how I was talking about the fifth principle where tailored approaches we know are more effective and that kind of stuff? Policing is so general. It's like, hey, Officer Lum, go out and do preventative patrol. Show omnipresence. Okay, that's what like most patrol officers are taught. Patrol around your area and make sure you try to keep people from, show some visibility. Okay, that's a very general approach to policing. Okay, there are also high levels of unstructured discretion. I think this should ring kind of similar probably in some of the legal fields. There's an incredible amount of discretion in policing. Officer A and Officer B and Officer C, all three officers could be on the same squad and working the same shift. And they might do three different things. They might address the same problem three different ways. They might have three different styles of their patrol. They might have three different understandings of what the mandate of policing is. What are the desired outcomes that the police should be achieving? Okay. There's an incredible amount of discretion in policing. There's also an incredible amount of, not an incredible amount of, there is a lack of supervision in policing. It's a match with all this discretion, okay? So there's very little structured discretion and there's very little structured supervision in policing, okay? So all of this to say that going back to this, a lot of what policing is doing is not only at odds with the evidence, but it's also at odds with trying to implement the evidence in practice. Why? Because there's so much discretion. There's so much unsupervised activity out there, okay, in policing. And let me also say one thing that I think lawyers will also recognize some similarity with. Policing relies on one source of knowledge that is put up on a pedestal above all. Can anybody tell me what they think that is? One source of knowledge is the most important in policing. It trumps everything, any other source of knowledge, scientific knowledge or otherwise. Leslie says the law. Leslie, I like your answer because you would think that might be the case, right? You would definitely think, hey, that's got to be it, right? Not quite. Justin?
Yeah, I would say it's experience, like personal experience.
That's exactly it. That source of knowledge, it's like baseball before Moneyball, okay? That sort of experience is like what drives the decisions in policing. Anything that threatens that experience or that questions it is highly suspect, okay? And science, in many ways, it doesn't shun experience. I think experience is incredibly important in science, but it says, wait a second, we have to think about things a little more systematically. Maybe our experience, maybe our personal biases aren't the best way to go, okay? And that's a huge challenge to an evidence-based approach. Let me add a few more notes about why this is challenging in policing, using science in policing. It's not just experience that's blocking officers from accepting science, and many of them are not opposed to science. We have policing is becoming much more educated now. There's a lot of folks who have college education that are in policing. Okay, it's not that they're even not willing to try out something new. Be more preventative, be more proactive. I tend to work with a lot of police agencies that are willing to try these new things. They are willing to try to align themselves with the evidence and do different things to try to improve their practice. Okay. There's a bigger challenge here, and that is that the current policing approach that I just mentioned not only exists, but it is embedded. It's deeply institutionalized into the everyday aspects of policing. Your beliefs about what cops are doing every day is part of it. it like comes from a mythology that has grown up out of policing that kind of hides this embeddedness of a lot of this area, of a lot of these aspects of policing. And let me kind of go through what this is embedded, what these notions of policing that currently are so much a part of everyday US policing are embedded into. It's embedded into the mission, the expectations of officers, what people think the police are responsible for, okay? It's embedded in the training systems and general orders. So this reactive approach, this general approach, this case-by-case approach to policing is actually taught to officers, and it's taught with such a ferocity that it's like deep in their minds, okay? It's embedded in the histories, the traditions, the habits of patrol, investigations, and management. If you ask me all to go out right now and go to be patrol officer in the place that I live, you could put me in a patrol car and I probably could do it, okay? It hasn't really changed much because policing has like a certain type of a tradition and approach that is grounded in this very reactive, general, arrest-oriented approach that's embedded in the patrol, the investigations, and the management of those officers. So tactics that police are doing, investigative work that they're doing, all has these principles that are holding on to them with a vice-like grip. All the deployment in patrol and investigations, how cops are doing in detective work, how patrol officers are going around and doing their daily work in patrol, all of the aspects of policing that work against an evidence-based approach are embedded in those structures. It kind of gets worse. It's in the technologies too. The CAD system, the radio system, the even vehicles, the use of how officers use vehicles. This is why everyone, body-worn cameras, I've written a systematic review on this. You can bring body-worn cameras all day long into police agencies. They will then take that technology and use it in a reactive manner, right? They're not going to use it necessarily for the way that the public thinks or could imagine that body-worn cameras might be used in policing to improve accountability, maybe to reduce racial disparities in use of force. It's not being used in that way. Why? Because the systems and the institution of policing are so strong. It's going to take that technology and shape it to be used for its advantage. Okay, this is why we now know that most agencies want body-worn cameras. They're very welcoming of body-worn cameras. Okay, which is a bit of a red flag, frankly, but we can talk about that later. This reactive approach, this high discretionary approach, this individual-based approach is also deeply embedded in the supervision styles of policing, the management, the way leadership expresses itself, etc. And finally, all the rewards. Think about like why police get, how you might get promoted in policing, how you might get transferred to a specialized unit, the little ribbons that you get for bravery and this and that, right? All of it supports a very traditional approach to policing and not one that's necessarily aligned with what we know actually leads to good policing, okay? So achieving an evidence-based approach in policing really requires more than generating the research. And so many of us who are in this field, not only, it's kind of a hard field in this regard, because not only are we responsible for doing good science, for testing, for generating the science around different tactics, etc., but we also have to figure out how are we going to implement it into practice. And that's why evidence-based policing, and I guess I'll leave you with this and just make a couple of points about this, but evidence-based policing is more than just number one that you see here. It's then about how we take that knowledge and we translate it somehow to police. For example, today, I was just working with a group of officers where we're just trying to translate number 4. You know, the 4th principle where I was talking about targeted approaches for individuals? We were just trying to take that principle and talk about it from an operations standpoint. What does that look like in operations? How do you think, how do you do risk assessment? Risks, what do you risk assess, like on what, right? How would you use a targeted approach inside of an agency to identify officers that are more likely going to use excessive force, right? How do you do that? Okay. And so thinking about that translation is like so challenging just on its own. Okay. The next part of evidence-based policing, in addition to translating, is creating receptivity towards the science. And I don't mean winning hearts and minds, okay? I mean that folks would actually say, wait a second, this is what policing is about. This is what good policing is about. This is exactly what I should be doing. I want to be more proactive, place-based, preventative, community-oriented. I want to do that because I believe that that's what policing is about, okay? You all might imagine how challenging that is if currently everything that's taught to police is not about that, okay? It's also about how to institutionalize an evidence-based approach into everyday systems. So let me just give a small example. Here, let me go to this. Okay, let me give an example of this. Okay, here. So you translate evidence, you translate the research, you have to build receptivity to the research, and you have to then institutionalize somehow that research into practice, because we don't care if officers, can cite lum et al. When they're doing, a particular intervention. I don't care. Are they doing the intervention, right? So one thing that we're working with an agency right now on is just trying to get officers to try out very simple evidence-based proactivities. We call them plays because we have a whole playbook on this, right? But we want them to just do a play in the 15 minutes when they're not doing anything in between calls for service. By the way, that time in between calls for service could be like 5 hours. It could be as short as 2 minutes. It could be as long as 5 hours. But we know that on average, about 30% of an officer's time is uncommitted to anything, okay? So what would they do during that time? Well, they need some guidance about what to do during that time. So we have these playbooks, but we're also asking this agency to create something in their CAD. So when the officer does that play, he or she can call it out. And so he can say, I'm doing play number 5, right? That gets recorded and then it can be tracked. Why do we care about this? Because we want to know, are officers actually doing some of these things? And are they being held accountable to it? You can't do it without knowing if they're doing it and then tracking it and holding officers accountable to it, okay? That's a very shortcut way of trying to explain this accountability mechanism within a broader supervisory institution, a system within an agency that needs to be recalibrated in order for you to do something as simple as implementing a proactivity inside of an officer's patrol day, okay? Let me give one more example of this. Investigations. Okay, I'll talk about investigations. We have a little bit of knowledge about investigations that show that when officers make extra effort or when they use a particular technology or crime analysis in the investigation, they can clear that crime more quickly and more positively, okay? Like a homicide or a shooting or something like that, okay? Well, how do you get the investigator? I mean, investigators, I don't know if you all know what investigations look like, but it's not very structured at all. Like I used to be a detective in special victims. You get a call, somebody reports to you child abuse, right? And there's a lot of paperwork, there's a whole process about dealing with that. But how I go about doing my investigation, it varies between myself and the guy next to me. For example, I could first start trying to interview witnesses and victims and maybe try to find the suspect. I might take a look at technologies like surveillance technology, LPR. I might look at body cameras. I might go find some CCTV stuff. I might look at someone's cell phone and try to discern something from that cell phone. I might talk to the kid's teacher or try to understand the routines of that child and see how, just to be able to identify the subject, right? To see where they're going and how they're moving around, right? All of that stuff is part of the process of an investigation. The way that I do it, the effort that I put into that, the order that I do those things, the timing of all of that may make the difference between whether or not I solve that case or not. Okay. Right now, it's just based on an officer's experience or detective's experience. Some agencies have tried to do checklists, for example, to make sure that they're hitting all of those things. Other agencies have tried to use some form of checklist that's temporal, like you need to do this first or this first or this, right? And the question is, are any of those things useful in improving the outcome of an investigation? If they were, if we knew that, right? This is an area of not a lot of research, but if we knew that, then changing those checklists, then changing that order of investigation, or adjusting the amount of times I try to find an individual. Let's say 2 times is not enough. So I'm going to say you must try to find the victim 3 times, or you must try to find a witness 3 times, as opposed to once or twice, because just that 3rd time, evidence shows that you might have a better outcome. Okay. I hope this is kind of sinking in what I'm talking about. The level of detail that a system has to be adjusted to make it more aligned with the research evidence is high. Okay. So a great deal of evidence-based approaches is really about taking the research knowledge and then figuring out how it becomes operationalized or implemented. Okay. So I guess I'll stop with that to say that, to conclude that when you all are thinking about evidence-based courts, there's a whole area of evidence-based courts or evidence-based legal decision-making, or evidence-based criminal justice policy or something like that, right? It's not just about what do we know from science, like what does science tell us about whether or not, prosecutorial discretion, for example, reduces equitable outcomes or something like this, or sentencing guidelines. We now know sentencing guidelines can have negative effects on equitable outcomes, right? It's not just knowing those things. It's then how do you get prosecutors to change their discretionary approaches? Harder question, how do you get judges to change their practices, right? If they're doing something that may not be the most effective in terms of the delivery of justice, okay? Or defense attorneys, how can you change their practices in order to be more aligned with something, or pre-trial, or whatever you're thinking about in the legal field, okay? And I just put some questions here to leave you with. These are just some I thought that some of you might be interested in from a legal profession side. I'm sure there's more, and I apologize because it's not an area of expertise of mine. But these are the types of questions that I think are still open-ended. We don't have enough research on this. Will laws restraining police use of force actually reduce excessive use of force? By the way, body-worn cameras, we know that body-worn cameras can reduce complaints against the police, but the studies looking at body-worn cameras and their impact on uses of force, it's very mixed, okay? I'm more interested in, will body-worn cameras contribute to greater accountability and fairness in policing? We have very few studies on this at all, even though that's kind of the reason why, body-worn cameras were supposedly adopted. Okay, this is again why I think there might be some red flag here. It's always a red flag if an organization likes a technology that's meant to serve as an accountability mechanism on them, but they like it and they want to adopt it. Okay, so why we think that police like this, because they think it can hold citizens accountable more than it can hold police accountable. Okay. Will legal remedies for traffic stops reduce unwarranted disparities? In Virginia, they're trying to reduce the use of traffic stops for certain types of violations. Will that actually achieve the results that we're trying to achieve, which is the reduction of disparity in traffic stops? It may or may not. Okay. Will diversion of 911 calls to non-police entities work to achieve outcomes sought? Will changes in gun laws impact gun crimes? This is a huge question that I'm particularly concerned about with regards to mass violence. Okay. Can adjustments to prosecutorial discretion impact deterrence? I mean, there's tons of questions. I just try to think of 6 just to give some idea. Okay. And then once you find the answer to these questions, how do you implement that finding into practice? Okay. So that's evidence-based policing in a nutshell. I guess I will open it up to any questions that you might have. It's kind of hard for me to explain it so quickly, but I hope you got some gist of it. Let me stop sharing so I can see who's raising their hand. Justin.
Yeah, I have 2 quick questions. So I'm doing my research on the statutory bases for community police review boards in New York. And so at the beginning, you talked about internal police, basically evaluations of their policies and practices.
Yes.
And I was curious about what your thoughts on how a lot of the police review boards have the ability to review and implement, at least at the superficial level,
Yes.
recommendations for changes.
Yes.
How do you feel like that could change
Oh.
from a superficial to an actual?
Oh, that's a great question. I was just giving a speech to NACOL. I don't know if you're familiar with NACOL.
No.
It's a National Association of Civilian Oversight, something. Oh,
Okay.
gosh. But they're a group that oversees a lot of civilian oversight groups across the country. Okay. And yes, thank you, Jessalyn. NACOL. And I was just telling somebody asked me the same question, right? Evidence-based policing should be very of a high concern to citizen review boards and oversight groups. Why? Because a scientific approach is like an accountability approach, essentially. Right. It's like trying to look at very specific things about an agency and whether or not it's effective or whatever. And that requires transparency and ability to access that information. So, for example, police collect a lot of internal data. They collect internal data on complaints, on uses of force, I tend to look at what I call bulk data. It's like these CAD data is a rich area of trying to understand what cops are doing on a day-to-day basis, right? It's very data thick, but it has so many clues about not only how police interpret their world, but what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So yes, I think there's a lot of intersection between an evidence-based approach and an accountability approach. What I was talking to NACOL about is when you're thinking about citizen oversight, it's not just about case by case. Like a lot of these citizen oversight groups are like, they get a case about an officer that needed some discipline about something, right?
Right.
That's okay. Like I understand the purpose of that, but how to think more preventatively, right? How could those citizen oversight boards think in collaboration with the police about how to prevent those problems to begin with, right? Some people like to call Derek Chauvin a bad apple. I don't believe in bad apple theory. Like everything arises, in my view. There are some bad apples, all right. But most of the time, what's driving a lot of the behavior of bad apples is something more bigger about the institution itself, okay? For example, with Chauvin, the reason why he got there in the first place was a belief by the police that dealing with small things and arresting for them was important, all right? Floyd, what was he being pulled up for? Like allegedly, they don't even know this for sure, but allegedly passing a $20 counterfeit bill at a convenience store. that's like such a low level offense, right? But he treated it as if Floyd like just killed somebody, right? And so, sorry, Justin, I'm digressing.
That's okay.
But going back to your question, there is this great overlap between taking a scientific approach and thinking about citizen oversight, because researchers are citizens. We're a very important part of the citizen oversight. We don't often think of ourselves in that way, but it is the case. And science plays some of that role. And I think some of the founding fathers, when they were thinking about democracy, not all of them, but some of them had this vision of the role of science in democracy. Shelby. Sorry, Shelby, were you next in? I'm just going in the order I'm seeing them. Okay, Shelby.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm a fellow criminology major in undergrad before I came to law school.
Okay.
I have a special love in my heart for it. So I really appreciate it today. But I wanted to ask, as somebody that has been in a specific police institution, obviously you're more familiar than the culture than we would be,
Yeah.
because I have never had any kind of police service. But how do you get past, as somebody from the outside, the initial defensiveness and the close ranks, boys club, as somebody that's going to be interacting with police officers in my legal career for the rest of my life and in this research? I just wanted some recommendations or advice from you about that.
Oh, that's a great question, Shelby, because frankly, even with my police experience, I struggle with this. Okay, so don't think because you don't have any police experience, you can't be a good scholar or police researcher or legal, that's just BS. Okay. For example, sometimes I'll get the question, well, how long were you a police officer? And I'll get judged by that, right? If I wasn't long enough, then, well, no, this person, we shouldn't trust her, right? Or, I mean, look at me, right? I don't look like a cop, I just don't have, I was the only Asian female in the whole Baltimore city they had ever seen. And so ever. And so, that was crazy. People used to think I could speak all kinds of languages and call me for interpretation and all sorts of craziness, right? So I say all that to you to say, it's not about not having the policing experience. It's about a couple things. When you're going into a police agency, many agencies are now open to outsiders doing research, thinking, trying to do reform, etc. in their agency. But it's also about relationships. It's how you approach them, right? If I went into an agency with what I really thought and was like, oh, this is somebody, you're a hot mess, right? You need help and I'm going to help you. That's not how it works. Often it's a give and take. I have to learn about what they think is a priority for them, right? In their minds, it might be like, I have a lot of shootings. I don't know what to do with them. I got officers that are leaving my force. And so some of my early research that I used to do was just some basic, what I would call descriptive statistics that an agency needed. And it helped me build a relationship with them. And then I could say, okay, let me try to, and so some agencies I've worked with now for years and years, because building that relationship really is fundamental to doing research in agencies that are incredibly shrouded in mystery, mythology, and lack of transparency. All right. And also being straightforward about your findings. Some police researchers that I know have great intentions, but they don't want to give bad news. A lot of research is bad news, I'm sorry to say. Why? Because we're lifting up the rock. And what's under the rock? Bugs. Okay. You're never going to lift up the rock and find a pot of gold. Okay. It's always bugs, right? So when you're thinking about doing research in policing, you always have to think about, first, always make the ask. Try to find people that are also doing research in policing and connect with them. All my studies are with partners. They're with research partners, they're with collaborators, all this stuff. Never feel like you're on your own. Talk to your advisors, see if they know a police department that they're amenable with that can help you get an in someplace. I hate to say it, but a lot of research is still done in kind of that sense. You have to ask and you have to kind of put your neck out there, right? But never, ever take no for an answer. And always feel free to do the cold ask, because you never, ever know about policing. I always do a lot of cold asking. Now it's a little bit easier, for me. People know who I am and they're willing, they want to do stuff. But when I first started, I would just call up. I called up the Boston commissioner in my first year as an assistant professor at Northeastern. Hey, would you mind coming and giving a guest lecture in my class? And she's like, sure, right? She just came by, and then I got to know her a little bit more and think about how I wanted to do research in that agency, and start with a small project and build on something that they were interested in and that I could challenge them with. Like anything else, it's about relationships. Okay. I wish I had more time to talk to you about this, just because this is an area that you can accomplish. You don't have to be an ex-cop to do it. And sometimes that can hurt you if you're an ex-cop. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sure. David, and then Deidre.
So at the beginning, you discussed the objectives of policing, and something that, in a sense to me, it kind of seemed like ideal objectives. I think, practically speaking, one of the objectives of policing is to facilitate the high profit real estate market, or to create conditions where the real estate market is very profitable for the people who participate in it. So one of the things we talked about with police that we didn't mention that police do is they carry out evictions. It's an important task of police and sheriffs. And of course, they arrest people who are, I think disrupt was the category on police activity there, but people are making a scene, people who make other people uncomfortable, particularly homeless people. And I think that, we also see this in, the way thinking of how the San Francisco DA Chesson Bowden was targeted for a recall, targeted for a recall by the real estate lobby because of policies that involved fewer people being arrested and being put in jails. So the objective of facilitating high profit real estate, that doesn't really involve evidence-based policing, right?
I hope that, this is just my personal belief, but I hope that no scholar comes up with some evidence on how to facilitate that. Let me just say, David, that just to respond to some of your thoughts, I guess, I'm not sure if there was a question in there, but
well, the question would be, do you think that is related to that could explain why police groups haven't necessarily embraced evidence-based policing, because it doesn't necessarily align with some of the actual objectives of policing?
I would say that, first of all, I understand what you're asking about now. I think you have a point that police officers may view their job in one way. Okay, whether or not they view it, they're thinking about all the things that you mentioned. They might not consciously think that, but it might be subconscious, frankly, because as I guess Durkheim would say, the law itself is also to create that boundary between what we're trying to think about as socially acceptable, right? And so, I think that's a good thought, just because when we're trying to think about like what the police are supposed to do, or what their outcomes that they're hoping for are, if there's not an agreement, right, about what the police are responsible for, or what they should be doing, or how sensitive they should be to vulnerable populations, for example. If there's not an agreement about that, then yes, some of these things are going to be harder, right? And I think why some of these things are harder, because, for example, problem solving, prevention, some of these place-based approaches, they're not about arresting somebody. Oftentimes they're about working collaboratively with the community to try to come up with some solution that doesn't involve arrest. In some cities that I've worked in, you have police who are behind pushing for better housing for those who need it, not anybody else. Why? Because the police are seeing the ramifications of when people don't have good access to affordable, good housing or safe housing, right? I'm working with an agency now where there's a police commander who is obsessed by this. I mean, he's not interested in locking up homeless people. He's trying to fight the city to try to figure out, or the county to try to figure out a better way to provide resources for them, because he knows that that's the way to solve this problem, right? So yeah, I think you have a really good point there. Very good thinking around it. I never really thought of it in those terms, but I think if there's an incongruence with our belief about what the police are responsible for, then yes, science can struggle.
Could I just ask
And it
quick
can be used negatively also. Let me just say, David, if people believe that, the police should be doing something really bad, you can come up with some science about it.
what is the city where the police chief is working at?
It's not a police chief. It's not a police chief. It's someplace in Long Island, where in a particular part of Long Island, there is a supervising commander. He doesn't hold a great high rank, but that he's trying to work on this particular problem. It's it's of high interest to him. Okay, Deidre.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know what's going on with my camera. Everything just kind of blanked out.
That's okay. I saw you before.
First, I want to thank you for your presentation and for highlighting reactive policing, which is something that I feel very attached to and would love to, discuss, more within the consortium. But one of the things that I feel that I'm struggling with more is the definition of crime, because it appears that, an act can be a crime in one neighborhood, just, kind of piggybacking off of what David Kinzer said. The crime it's a crime in one neighborhood to say, I don't know, have a marijuana joint and, they're going to throw the book at someone, but in a completely different neighborhood, it's something that gets overlooked. It's the difference between, say, a crack house and, an urban area and, a cocaine apartment in New York, where they throw very elaborate, coke laden in parties. Yeah. And so I am really struggling.
Or white collar crime versus.
Yes. So I'm really struggling with the definition of crime now, because it's really kind of hard to make sense out of, how policing is taking place when you only see it done to certain people. Yeah. And if you could comment on that, that would be great.
I mean, I guess my comment would just be a personal one. Yes. I mean, this is like justice. It's not just the definition of crime. It's the implementation of justice that varies across places. It varies across officers on the same shift in the same neighborhood. Okay. And how different cities view certain types of things versus others. Like, for example, in the post that I used to police in, like low level drug stuff is like, you would have to be arresting people all day, frankly. And most people are just substance abuse. They have substance abuse problems, and it's not like to arrest somebody, in my view, for something like that would not be worthwhile. It would be more worthwhile to like focus on people that are shooting people in my beat and making people feel afraid who live there. Okay. But that may not be a shared view between the guy that takes over my next shift 8 hours later. It may also not be the same view of a county next door to Baltimore City, in which if they saw that, they would be calling the police left and right, right? And so, yeah, Deidre, all I can say is that I empathize with your struggle with what is crime, and I'm especially concerned about like white collar crime. I mean, good Lord, like some of the damage that has been done by white collar criminals, I would say is incredibly high compared to, you know, maybe somebody stole your car yesterday, okay? But there's a lot more effort put on that person who stole your car. So, yeah, I don't have a good answer for you from a personal point. From a scientific standpoint, though, what I think would be interesting is looking at the variation of enforcement across places, across officers, across people. That would be the way that I would approach a question like that. A criminologist would approach it. People definitely view crime differently, right? But what is the empirical reality of that? Some might be surprised that in a place like where I used to police, that I would not arrest individuals for certain types of crime. They might think, no, you would, right? Because their belief is such that that's the case, right? But that might not necessarily be true. There, for example, a lot of people believe that 911 calls about mental health, people in mental distress, is somehow very high right now. It's actually one of the smallest proportions of calls for service to the police. It's like 3% or something like that. It's very, very low, right? So even if you moved all those calls away from the police and sent them over to someone else, you'd still have a whole bunch of calls for service. It wouldn't change the volume of calls for service. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of different views about what the police are responsible for, what is crime, how much should people, what punishment should people get for this and that. And there's a lot of difference in those opinions. I'm sorry, that's it's not a fulfilling answer. It's not a fulfilling answer, but as a scientist, we would study it.
It's just good that there is some, that there is some awareness of it. I think it's the big elephant in the room that no one wants to, that no one wants to talk about. And I think it has a lot to do with what, David was saying in terms of real estate and protecting values in certain areas. I mean, if you're policed in Baltimore, then you're pretty familiar with it. What I would think you'd be pretty familiar with Georgetown, and how, although you see lots of cops down in Georgetown in DC, you don't see the harassment that you would see, say, in a Baltimore.
I would say, Deidre, just from an evidence-based perspective, from a scientific perspective, right? Think about kind of what you're saying. You have a sense of this, right? I guess as Popper would say, you have a sense of something because you're observing it, right? From a scientific perspective, we would want to know, well, how frequent is that? What are the ramifications of that? Where is that occurring? Is that true, this Georgetown thing that you think you're observing, right? And then how can I empirically test that? What would mitigate that problem? Okay, if there is such a disparity, what kinds of things would mitigate that problem? How would we get the police to do those things to mitigate that problem, right? That would be the question of a criminologist. Whether or not people define crime differently, yes, is true. Jessalyn, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Recognizing we are short on time, but I wanted to elevate one question from the chat from Leslie, who is currently in moot court, so can't take herself off mic. But her question is there a risk that specific place crime deterrence measures will have a negative effect in which certain communities will continue to be over-policed?
Yeah, so people have raised this issue. The evidence does not show this, interestingly. It doesn't show that a hotspots approach or place-based approach will reduce the legitimacy of the police in that neighborhood or cause more oppressive style policing. However, there's a caveat, okay? It matters what the police are doing. So those tests that look at that are not looking specifically at 1990s style zero tolerance combined with stop, question, and frisk policing, okay? That's the type of policing actually that I'm from, that era is the era that I'm from. Okay. It's not often looking at that. My best sense is yes, it can definitely have a negative effect. If any place-based approach or proactive approach or preventive approach is done in a way that is that doesn't protect rights, that disparages people, that creates disparities amongst groups, as Deidre was kind of alluding to, right? Or David was alluding to. If it does so in illegal ways or unconstitutional ways, this is the problem with stop, question, frisk, which in a lot of zero tolerance regimes was used unconstitutionally, okay? If things are done in those ways at hotspots, yes, it can have a negative effect in my view. Whether or not we see science that shows that, no, because much of the hotspots research around this particular area are not like oppressive based approaches. And oh, let me also say, just to, as a side note to answer this question, hotspots approaches that use problem-oriented approaches and more preventative approaches, more tailored approaches that are collaborative with the community are more likely to have longer-term sustained effects on crime and disorder. So we know that there is a possibility that oppressive approaches are going to have a negative effect on the legitimacy of the police, on disparity, all those sorts of things. And we also know that more tailored, proactive, and problem-solving approaches are more likely to succeed. It gives us a hint that when you're doing these types of approaches, you need to do things that are not going to lead to negative reactions from the community. And let me also add, when you're doing a hotspots approach, telling the community and knowing how to gauge when that community thinks that you have overstepped your bounds is an incredibly important part of that internal data collection that I was talking about with the police. This is something that police agencies don't often do. They do like random sample community surveys. They do like community meetings where they ask people their opinions, but they don't systematically understand people's reactions in real time to an intervention that's being done in a particular neighborhood. And understanding that in real time helps agencies to moderate their approach if they overstep their bounds. I hope that makes sense. That's a very complex question that she's asking about, and it really elicits a stronger answer that I can't give in more than I need more than 3 minutes for. Okay, I don't mind going a little bit over if some of you want to stay around. Justin?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly talk about the implementation of,
Sure.
a switch from a reactive to a proactive or preventative base. A lot of even large police agencies are sometimes not, I don't want to say equipped or manned, but because they have plenty of personnel, but they're not really trained in any kind of way that would allow them to do that. So how do you think, aside from completely revamping what a police organization looks like, how do you think, like, what other options, like universities or think tanks and things like that, and integrating those within police forces, do you think that would be a viable way?
Oh, great question, because we do this right now. We are a project where we're trying to do this right now. I hate to say, yes, you have to revamp the whole police department, but yes, you have to revamp the whole police department. It's about, though, picking and choosing your priorities, okay? So, for example, you can train people all day long, but if you don't have the mechanisms within the patrol deployment to ensure that what they're being trained on is actually being used, then you've wasted millions of dollars in training. It's not going to help. Okay. So oftentimes we start at patrol, and we start with like just the everyday aspects of patrol and what cops are doing, and trying to get them to do 1 or 2 proactive things. We're trying to adjust their mindset through practice. We're trying to essentially build experience, since they value that so much. We're trying to build experience, and so that experience then becomes something that they can rely on, okay? I know that sounds so like micro level, But yes, that is what we're up to right now with a couple of agencies that we're working with. We also might work with sergeants on how to coach those officers on how to do those things on a day-to-day basis, okay? We might link that coaching to some formal training that's not just a one-up training, but something that lasts like 3 months, where we keep working with supervisors, giving them exercises, ask them go do stuff in the field, bring it back, talk it out with us, argue it out with us, right? And try to work on adjusting what they're doing. We also look at performance metrics. So there's like performance metrics that officers are trying to hit. You change those, you can force different kinds of change. Now, that's not always the best approach, because you want people to understand why they're doing it. You don't want them to be resistant to a performance metric, right? But if you make a performance metric that you have to do like 50 traffic stops a month, they're going to hit that, right? So adjusting that performance metric is key. I mean, I can go on and on about the little things that we're trying to, it's like recalibrating a huge machine, okay? And yes, that's what we're doing. You work from the top up, you work from the bottom, so top down, you work from the bottom up, you work sideways, you like try to get levers and push and pull those things. It's a lot, it's a hell of a lot of work, implementation. It's not very sexy. It's not like Nobel Prize winning type work. And that's why like the most famous criminologists probably not involved in this type of thing. Okay. They have an important role. They develop the research in some regards, but what I think is really interesting and really important for a criminologist to work on is how to figure out the levers in an agency that make these things happen. So we try out different things and we test those things. And we say, well, what works best? What lever really works? What doesn't work very well? Okay. And what's your project on, Justin?
I'm doing statutory bases for community police review boards.
Okay. I was trying to find a parallel to that, but I'm sorry, I cannot think of it off the top.
Yeah, there probably is. I was just more curious. I also was I was criminal justice undergrad, so just
are you a
curiosity.
former law enforcement officer?
No, but I am active guard right now.
Okay. All right. So anybody that works in an organization, I think, can understand what I'm talking about. There are things in that the legal profession. I mean, academia, there's like things in those organizations that keep the traditions alive, right? Undoing that is the stuff of life. That is where the real change happens. This is why I'm very skeptical of like people who think if I can pass a law, then we can stop the next Derek Chauvin. I don't think you can stop the next Derek Chauvin by passing a law that bans chokeholds or neon neck. I think it's great symbolically to pass that law and to make it criminal, and because these cops need to be thrown in jail. Okay, but that's not going to stop it. What's going to stop it is stronger accountability mechanisms, stronger supervision, right? Bystander work. So like now there's a lot of work on getting other cops to stop cops from doing, he had 5 bystanders. And not only that, but other people telling him that he was going to kill Floyd, including people from the EMT side of things. And he just refused to listen. Okay. That's an interesting finding scientifically in and of itself, because it gives you a window into everything about policing that went wrong there. And it's not just the bad apple of Derek Chauvin. Okay. And I know Minneapolis Police Department well. We've done a lot of work with them. They have all kinds of special things going on, community policing, blah, 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 right? But deep in its core, it was still very insulated from all of those reforms, okay? And so that's how you end up with Derek Chauvin. Everybody in the police department knew about him, and they knew he was bad. That's like, I mean, good Lord, if you know that, then now there's no excuse, okay? But sorry, I'm going down a tangent again. That's a bad area for me to go down. Jesselyn? I don't know if anybody else has questions. Some of these questions, I don't know if I can even answer them properly. Sorry. David's
No.
question threw me off. I was like, it was a good one. I have to bring in a sociologist who knows more about Durkheim for that one.
Well, I've got ideas for the spring fellowship, so thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
There is one more question. This is also a big one, but do you think, sorry, this is in the chat from Jacqueline, who is at Northern Illinois University. Do you think qualified immunity plays a role in perpetuating reactive policing?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know if it plays a role in perpetuating reactive policing, because reactive policing on its own, it's like very powerful in policing. You don't need much to continue it, right? But I do think there's something to be said about, there's a lot of mythology that covers policing. And the best way to explain this is just by television shows. You can see the mythology play out in television shows. And that mythology is created by people, citizens. It's also generated by the police. And it keeps folks from knowing the things, for example, that I know about policing, not because I was a police officer, but from my research experience, from seeing it through research, from getting into the nitty gritty of the data, or some of my research is qualitative, and seeing it actually as it is, okay? So I don't think it is that certain things like qualified immunity or even unions or things like that actually perpetuate it, but it certainly contributes to the mythology that then doesn't allow us to question it or study it or think more carefully about it, test it, hold it up to a better standard, and then change it, okay? And so, I mean, you all don't want me to go into unions. Unions are a significant reason for why, well, they were developed in response to the civil rights movement, against the civil rights movement in the 60s, and as a protection for the police against that movement. And so in many ways, the unions serve as a block, in my view, to a lot of reforms in policing. And it perpetuates a lot of this insulation, but not the only thing. Other things keep police very isolated from public understanding or public view, including some policing scholars who believe that, for example, the police should decide what is good policing. Like, I don't even understand that. Doesn't make sense to me, but there is a group of scholars that maybe I'm being a little too harsh, but there's some scholars that believe that police themselves know their profession best, that it's some kind of craft, and that they have important insights into how to shape that craft. Now, I give you one thing. I think the people that are doing the work, we need to include them in our research, not just the police, but the community and others who are involved in policing. They need to be involved in research, absolutely. But the mandate of the police is not determined by the police. At least that's my view from a democratic standpoint. I could be wrong, but that's my sense of things. I don't think the police should make their own mandate. I think that's a bad way to go. But on the other hand, you have the Deidre problem and the David problem. If it's not the police, it'll be somebody else. And usually it's people in power or, the government of the day or what have you. So that's also a challenge, right? And we can't always rely on the law. I don't want to say this to a whole bunch of lawyers, I'm sorry. But the law only speaks to a small portion of what the police are doing. It's like a very small part of policing. Much of policing is not above, but it's outside the law. It's like just people having disputes with each other. and the cops are like called to deal with that. Or I see something suspicious. That's not illegal, you know, but it's bothering me. It's making me afraid or something like that, right? Yeah, I live in Loudoun County. I have called the cops on deer, like, because I think they look dangerous. I don't know. I'm from LA. If you see a big deer running around, that seems like it could be dangerous to somebody. So I call 911. My husband says that I have caused a hotspot in our, you know, because he's a criminologist, and so he thinks I've caused a hotspot in my neighborhood by calling on the animals.
Wildlife hotspot policing is something I have not thought about before, so that's a very interesting.
This thing had horns. I mean, you know, when you're from LA, it's like any kind of live animal running around is dangerous. It's like, it's weird.
You know, in Virginia, animal control is part of our police department, so you can.
Really?
Yes. So you can call the police when there are animals in your yard, because the animal control will actually come out, and we have animal court.
Deidre, when I called 911, the dispatcher pretty much hung up on me. She's like, why are you bothering me with this BS? She's like, just don't get near it. So, well, thank you all for your great questions. Jessalyn, this is a great group. I'm glad you included me in having me talk to them.
It truly is. And I think the group only benefited from hearing from you. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your wealth of expertise and experience with us.
It's my pleasure. And I wish you all the best. You know, when all of you are, maybe someday, some of you are going to be Supreme Court justices, and I'll be like, hey, I taught that person a webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
And we'll be sure to keep you informed of the great work that the students are doing as well, because there might be some opportunity for overlap. And
maybe you all can come up with something for Translational Criminology magazine about what you're doing. We have a magazine, and you can maybe write a feature, Jessalyn, about your group and what you guys are up to and why it's important to kind of link.
I shared the most recent copy in our Slack channel. So if you've not, for the students, if you've not yet taken a look at that, go ahead and reference. I think I put it in the general channel. So there's some awesome articles that have been written there.
Yeah, it'd be great for people to know about what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. So, okay. Well, I gotta go have dinner.
Same.
So,
thank you all for being here.
I'll see y'all later.
Cynthia, we'll talk to you soon. Everyone
Okay.
else, look forward to seeing you next week.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.